In a small town, a gifted young boy's music was shattered by a gang of bikers, but what happened next would change everything. When bikers crushed the boy's most treasured possession, his father's response stunned everyone. What happened next will make you believe in the power of community, redemption, and the unthinkable strength of a family. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. 12-year-old Marcus was a quiet, thoughtful boy who seemed to carry a melody wherever he went. His talent for playing the guitar had become the stuff of small-town legend, a gift passed down from his late grandfather, whose old, where the guitar had been Marcus's constant companion. The instrument was more than just an object. It was a lifeline to the man who had taught him about music, storytelling, and the beauty of expressing one's soul through sound. Marcus lived with his father, Elijah, in a modest home tucked into the heart of a peaceful, tight-knit community. Elijah was a single dad who worked tirelessly as a mechanic, balancing long hours at the garage with his role as a devoted parent. He had a reputation for being both firm and kind, instilling in Marcus a sense of resilience and integrity. When Marcus's grandfather passed away, leaving behind the cherished guitar in need of repair, it was Elijah who painstakingly restored it, breathing new life into the heirloom. To Marcus, it was a testament to his father's love and dedication. The neighborhood was quiet and familiar, a place where everyone knew each other's names. On sunny afternoons, Marcus could often be found in the park near his home, sitting under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, strumming his guitar. The music he played had a way of drawing people in. Passers-by would pause, caught up in the gentle rhythm, and sometimes offer a word of encouragement or a smile. His melodies, at once poignant and uplifting, seemed to echo the very soul of the town itself. But not all in the neighborhood shared the same warmth. The local biker gang, led by a burly, hot-tempered man named Jake, cast a shadow over the community. They were loud, brash, and intimidating, roaring through the streets on their motorcycles and claiming spaces as their own. Most townsfolk avoided crossing their path, unwilling to risk the wrath of a group that thrived on fear and control. Jake, in particular, was a figure both despised and dreaded. His towering frame and unpredictable temper made him a force that few dared challenge. The contrast between Marcus's gentle music and the biker's aggressive presence was stark. While Marcus sought to uplift and inspire, Jake and his gang seemed intent on asserting dominance. For the most part, their worlds didn't overlap. Marcus stayed in his quiet corner, and the bikers held sway over their chosen haunts. But the balance was fragile, and it wouldn't take much for their paths to cross in a way that would change everything. It was a warm afternoon, and the park buzzed with the gentle hum of life. Families strolled along the paths. Children played in the open fields, and Marcus sat under his favorite oak tree, his fingers dancing across the strings of his guitar. The melody he played was soft and lilting, a tune his grandfather used to hum on lazy Sunday mornings. The notes carried through the air, catching the attention of passers-by who slowed their steps to listen, some offering quiet smiles of appreciation. As Marcus played, the low rumble of engines shattered the serene atmosphere. Jake and his gang roared into the park, their motorcycles gleaming under the sun. The gang's arrival was like a sudden storm cloud, their presence drawing uneasy glances from those nearby. Jake dismounted his bike, his imposing figure commanding attention, while his gang lounged around, their laughter coarse and loud. At first, Jake seemed indifferent to the boy under the tree, but as Marcus's music reached their ears, curiosity drew Jake closer. He sauntered toward Marcus, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Marcus, focused on his music, didn't notice until Jake and the gang formed a loose circle around him. The boy's strumming faltered as he looked up, startled by the unwelcome audience. "Not bad, kid," Jake said, his voice dripping with a mocking edge. "Didn't know we had a little rock star in town." Marcus offered a polite smile, and went back to playing, hoping they'd lose interest. But Jake's grin widened at the boys' attempt to ignore him. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Jake said, his tone hardening. "You got a name, or do you just let the guitar do all the talking?" The gang chuckled, their laughter echoing in the uneasy silence of the park. Marcus glanced at them nervously, his fingers still strumming lightly. "It's Marcus," he said softly, trying to maintain a calm composure. "Marcus, huh?" Jake said, stepping closer. "That's a nice guitar you got there. Mind if I take a look?" Before Marcus could respond, Jake reached down and grabbed the guitar. Marcus stood up quickly, his heart racing. "Please, sir, don't," Marcus pleaded, his voice trembling. "It's my grandfather's guitar. It means a lot to me." Jake examined the instrument, pretending to admire it, but his smirk betrayed his true intentions. He strummed the strings clumsily, the discordant sound drawing laughs from the gang. "Sentimental, huh? That's sweet," Jake sneered. "Too sweet for this boring little town." As Marcus watched helplessly, Jake raised the guitar high above his head. "Let's see how much this thing can take." "No!" Marcus cried out, lunging forward, but one of the gang members held him back with a cruel laugh. With a loud crack, Jake brought the guitar down against the edge of the park bench. The sound of splintering would pierce the air as the beloved instrument broke into pieces. Marcus's heart sank, his legs buckling beneath him as he fell to the ground. Staring in disbelief at the ruins of the guitar, the gang erupted into laughter, their jeers mixing with the stunned silence of the onlookers. Some witnesses shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed, but no one dared to step forward. Jake tossed the broken remnants of the guitar at Marcus's feet. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess it wasn't built to last." With that, the bikers turned and walked back to their motorcycles, their laughter lingering in the air as they rode away. Marcus remained on the ground, tears streaming down his face as he gathered the shattered pieces of his grandfather's guitar. The people in the park looked on in quiet sympathy, but no one came to help. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus trudged home, clutching the broken remnants of the guitar. His heart was heavy with despair, the memory of Jake's laughter echoing in his mind. What had once been a cherished symbol of his grandfather's legacy now lay in ruins, and the weight of his helplessness pressed down on him like never before. Marcus walked through the door that evening with his head bowed, his arms clutching the shattered remains of his grandfather's guitar. His steps were slow and heavy, as if the weight of what had happened pressed down on his small frame. Elijah, sitting at the kitchen table after another long day at the garage, immediately sensed something was wrong. He turned to see Marcus standing there, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Marcus?" Elijah called out, his voice filled with concern. "What's going on? What happened?" Marcus looked up, his lip trembling as he held out the broken pieces. "They broke it, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah froze, his eyes locking onto the remains of the guitar. He took a step forward, his heart sinking. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice rising with barely restrained anger. "The bikers," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "Jake and his gang. They said it was funny, but I begged them to stop." Elijah clenched his fists, his breath coming in shallow bursts as a wave of fury washed over him. He looked at Marcus's tear-filled eyes and then down at the fragments of the guitar, a priceless heirloom, rich with history and meaning, now reduced to splinters. Taking a deep breath, he crouched in front of Marcus and rested a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," Elijah said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "This wasn't right, and I promise you, we'll figure this out. They don't get to walk away from this." Marcus nodded, though his tears didn't stop. Elijah pulled him into a firm embrace, vowing silently that no one would ever make his son feel this powerless again. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. In their small town, news traveled fast, especially when it involved the infamous biker gang. Neighbors stopped Elijah on his way to work, their voices hushed but tinged with outrage. "It's a disgrace what they did," Mr. Turner from down the street said, shaking his head. "That boy's done nothing but bring joy to this town with his music." "It's heartbreaking," agreed Mrs. Coleman, who often stopped to listen to Marcus play in the park. "But Elijah, be careful. Those men don't take kindly to being challenged." For every expression of sympathy and support, there were just as many warnings. Everyone knew what the bikers were capable of. Confronting them outright could have consequences far worse than a broken guitar. Elijah listened to it all, but his mind was already made up. He wasn't the kind of man to pick a fight, but neither was he someone who would let injustice slide. That evening after dinner, he sent Marcus to bed early and headed into his workshop. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead light. On the workbench lay the remnants of the guitar, carefully arranged in the same way Marcus had brought them home. Elijah sat down and picked up a piece, running his fingers over the jagged edge of the broken wood. It felt wrong, almost sacrilegious, to see the instrument that had carried so much love and history in such a state. As he stared at the guitar, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He couldn't let this stand, not just for Marcus, but for the principle of it. The bikers needed to understand that actions had consequences, but Elijah wouldn't stoop to their level. He would find a way to confront them that was both meaningful and just a way that would leave a mark on them far deeper than their cruelty had on Marcus. The light cast long shadows across the walls as Elijah sat back, his hands resting on the workbench. His expression, a mix of sorrow and steely resolve, betrayed the storm of thoughts running through his mind. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he would fight back, not with fists, but with the same kind of quiet strength he'd always taught Marcus to value. As the night deepened, Elijah's gaze remained fixed on the broken guitar. In those splintered pieces, he saw not just loss but opportunity, a chance to teach his son and the entire town what justice really looked like. With a deep breath, he stood and began sketching out the first steps of his plan. The bikers wouldn't see it coming. The morning after the incident, Elijah decided to visit the park where it all happened. He needed to understand exactly what Marcus had endured. The park, usually bustling with life, felt unusually subdued. Those who were there seemed to carry an air of unease, their conversations quieter, their glances wary. Elijah approached a man sitting on a bench, someone who had often nodded a friendly greeting to Marcus during his performances. "Morning, Bill," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm. "I heard you were here yesterday when it happened." Bill shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the park. "I was here," he admitted, keeping his voice low. "But Elijah, you've got to understand, those bikers don't mess around. Nobody wanted to get hurt." "I get it," Elijah said, though his jaw tightened at the thought of his son being left defenseless. "I'm not here to blame anyone. I just need to know what happened." Bill sighed and relayed what he had seen, his voice tinged with guilt. The boy stood up to them, Elijah. He tried to protect that guitar, but he trailed off, shaking his head. They didn't care. Jake smashed it like it was nothing. Elijah thanked him and moved on, speaking to a few others who had been there. Most were hesitant to talk, their fear of the gang palpable. A woman finally admitted, "We're all scared, Elijah. If you go after them, it could make things worse. For all of us." Elijah left the park with a clearer picture of the incident, but a growing frustration. The bikers had not only broken Marcus's guitar, but also instilled a fear that kept the town in silence. At home, Marcus was struggling in ways Elijah hadn't fully realized. Normally, Marcus would retreat to his room to practice his music, but now the house was quiet. Elijah found his son sitting at the edge of his bed, staring out the window, his hands fidgeting with the remaining guitar strings he had salvaged. "Marcus," Elijah said gently, stepping into the room. Marcus didn't look at him. "I feel like I lost everything, Dad," he said quietly. "The guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was my connection to Grandpa. It was me." Hearing the pain in his son's voice was like a knife to Elijah's heart. "You're not just that guitar, Marcus," he said firmly. Your music, your talent, that's all still inside you. No one can take that away. Marcus shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. It doesn't feel like it. I can't even hear the songs in my head anymore. Elijah knelt beside him. I know it's hard right now, but I promise, you'll find your music again. We'll get through this together. That night, Elijah decided to take a different approach. He knew Marcus needed more than words to rebuild his confidence. He needed to feel strong again. The next morning, Elijah led Marcus out to the backyard, where he had set up an old punching bag and a few basic weights. "What's this for?" Marcus asked, his brows furrowed. "It's time you learn how to defend yourself," Elijah said. "Not just with your fists, but with your mind and heart. Strength isn't just about muscles. It's about knowing who you are and standing up for it." At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't the type to fight, and the idea felt foreign to him. But Elijah was patient, guiding him through basic self-defense techniques and teaching him to channel his emotions into something productive. As the days went by, Marcus began to improve. With each jab and block, he seemed to regain a small piece of his confidence. Elijah also used their training sessions to share life lessons. People like Jake, they try to make you feel small because they're scared of their own weaknesses, Elijah said during one session. But strength isn't about bullying. It's about resilience. It's about knowing your worth and never letting anyone take that from you. Though progress was slow, Elijah could see a spark returning to Marcus. But the road was far from easy. There were nights when Marcus would sit silently at the dinner table, lost in his thoughts, and mornings when he would wake up reluctant to train. Still, Elijah remained steadfast, knowing that his son needed this foundation to rebuild himself. One evening, as Elijah watched Marcus land a clean punch on the bag, he felt a surge of pride. But beneath that pride was an unshakable resolve. Teaching Marcus resilience was only part of the solution. The bikers still roamed free, their intimidation unchecked, and Elijah knew the time would soon come to confront them. For now, he focused on strengthening his son's spirit, even as the shadow of what lay ahead loomed over them both. The morning after another long training session, Elijah and Marcus stopped by the town's local cafe for breakfast. It was a cozy, welcoming place run by Sarah, a warm-hearted woman who had always been kind to Marcus, often giving him free cookies whenever he performed in the park. When they walked in, Sarah immediately noticed Marcus's subdued demeanor and the tension in Elijah's eyes. "Elijah, Marcus," she greeted, her voice soft with concern. "How are my favorite duo today?" Elijah hesitated before answering. "We've had a tough week, Sarah," he admitted, sitting at the counter. Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "I heard what happened," she said, glancing at Marcus. "The whole town's talking about it. That gang has gone too far this time." "They have," Elijah agreed, his voice low but firm. "But most people are too scared to do anything about it." Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "I'm not scared, Elijah," she said, her tone resolute. "You've got more people on your side than you think. The town may seem quiet, but we care about what happens to you and Marcus. Don't give up on us yet." As they ate their breakfast, Sarah brought out a small bundle of polished wood. "This isn't much, but I thought it might help," she said, handing it to Elijah. "I know Marcus's guitar was special, but maybe you can use this to start fixing it." Elijah looked at her, surprised and grateful. "Thank you, Sarah," he said sincerely. "This means a lot." Later that afternoon, Elijah and Marcus stopped by Mr. Thompson's home. The retired music teacher had been a quiet presence in the community, known for his love of string instruments and his knack for repairing them. When Elijah explained what had happened, Mr. Thompson nodded gravely. "I've heard about Jake and his lot," he said, adjusting his glasses. "A bunch of cowards, if you ask me, destroying a young boy's guitar. There's no excuse for that." Elijah held out the broken pieces. "Do you think it's reparable?" Mr. Thompson studied the fragments carefully. "It won't be easy, but I've repaired worse. If we work together, I think we can bring it back to life." For the first time since the incident, Marcus's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "Really?" he asked. "Really," Mr. Thompson replied with a smile. "But I'll need your help, young man. You'll have to learn a thing or two about woodworking." From that day on, Marcus began spending his afternoons in Mr. Thompson's workshop, learning the intricacies of guitar repair. The old man's gentle patience and wealth of knowledge became a source of comfort and inspiration for the boy. Meanwhile, the community started showing subtle acts of support. A neighbor dropped off a box of guitar strings without a word. Another offered paint and varnish to help restore the guitar's finish. Even those who were too scared to speak openly found small ways to lend a hand. But not everyone was supportive. Jake, noticing the quiet but growing wave of solidarity around Elijah and Marcus, decided to send a message. Late one night, Elijah was woken by a loud crash outside. Rushing to his garage, he found the doors spray-painted with crude symbols and the windows shattered. Tools were strewn across the floor, and one of the cars he was working on had its tires slashed. Marcus appeared at his side, his face pale. "Dad, they did this, didn't they?" Elijah placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, though his own anger burned beneath the surface. "Yes, son," he said calmly. "They're trying to scare us, but we won't let them win." The next morning, Elijah began cleaning up the mess, his determination only strengthening. As he worked, a few neighbors stopped by to help. Mr. Turner brought a toolbox, and Sarah arrived with fresh coffee and pastries. "Looks like they're trying to break you," she said, handing Elijah a cup. "Don't let them." "I won't," Elijah replied. Jake's intimidation had the opposite effect of what he intended. Rather than cowering, Elijah became more resolute. The town's quiet support reminded him that he and Marcus were not alone, and that together they could face the challenges ahead. One evening, after a long day repairing the damage to his garage, Elijah made a decision that had been weighing on him for days. He could no longer stand by while the bikers terrorized the town and his family. The subtle acts of support from his neighbors had bolstered his resolve, but it was clear that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to take a stand directly. As the sun set, Elijah changed into his leather jacket, a relic from his own wilder youth, and grabbed a wrench, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of his trade and determination. He told Marcus to stay home, reassuring him that he wasn't looking for trouble, only a conversation. The biker's favorite bar, a dimly lit dive on the outskirts of town, loomed in the distance. Its parking lot was packed with motorcycles, their chrome gleaming under the neon sign that flickered intermittently. Elijah pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hitting him instantly. The bar went quiet as heads turned toward him. Jake, seated at the far end with his gang, looked up from his drink, his expression shifting from amusement to suspicion. Well, Jake drawled, leaning back in his chair. "If it isn't the town mechanic, what brings you to our humble establishment, Elijah?" Elijah walked steadily toward Jake, his eyes locked on the gang leader. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he refused to show fear. He stopped a few feet from their table, standing tall. "I'm here to talk," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. Man to man, Jake smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Talk? About what?" "How my boys, and I gave your kid a lesson in humility." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "I'm not here to fight, Jake. I'm here to warn you. You've crossed a line, breaking a boy's guitar, intimidating the town, vandalizing my shop. It stops now." The bar was deathly silent as Elijah's words hung in the air. Jake chuckled, but there was an edge to his laughter. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do?" Elijah stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you, if you or your boys so much as look at Marcus or anyone else in this town the wrong way, there will be consequences." Jake's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. standing up to tower over Elijah. "And what are you going to do about it, old man?" Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "You don't want to find out." For a moment, the tension in the room was unbearable. Jake stared at Elijah, searching for any sign of weakness. But Elijah's steady confidence unnerved him, even if he didn't show it. Finally, Jake laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, sitting back down. "But guts won't get you far around here." Elijah turned and walked out of the bar without another word. The bikers watched him go, their bravado masking a flicker of unease. Jake, however, was not one to let things go. Later that night, he gathered his gang, determined to remind the town who was in charge. "That mechanic thinks he's tough," Jake sneered. "Let's see how tough he is when we turn up the heat." The next day, Marcus returned from school visibly shaken. Elijah, who had been working in the garage, noticed immediately. "Marcus? What's wrong?" "They were at the park again," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "Jake's guys, they were waiting for me. They didn't hurt me, but they said things. About you, about Mom, and they threw my notebook in the mud." Elijah clenched his fists, his calm exterior cracking. He pulled Marcus into a reassuring hug. "They're cowards," he said, "and cowards always go after what they think will hurt you most. But they're not going to win. Not this time." That night, Elijah sat in his workshop, staring at the pieces of the broken guitar. The town had shown him that they believed in him, but the bikers' latest attack made it clear that his warning wasn't enough. For the first time, he began to wonder if the only way to protect Marcus was to fight fire with fire. Just as he was lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. Sarah stood there, holding a small package. "I thought you could use this," she said. Inside the package was a beautifully crafted guitar neck, custom-made by a craftsman she knew in a neighboring town. Elijah's eyes widened. "We're all behind you, Elijah," Sarah said. "But you have to stay smart. Don't let them drag you down to their level." Elijah nodded, her words grounding him. The guitar would be repaired, and so would Marcus's spirit. But as he prepared for the days ahead, Elijah knew that Jake wouldn't stop until he was forced to, and that would require more than just resilience. The stakes had just been raised. As the days passed, Elijah's resolve grew even stronger. He could no longer wait for Jake to make the next move. Instead, Elijah took matters into his own hands, using a different strategy, one that required more than just physical strength. He had learned long ago that the true key to a person's heart wasn't in how hard you hit them, but in understanding what drove them. Through the grapevine, Elijah heard whispers about Jake's past, rumors that painted a picture of a man who wasn't always the hardened biker he seemed to be. People in town spoke of a young Jake, an orphan child raised in a rough neighborhood, bounced from one foster home to another. He was always on the outside, never truly fitting in, and had been taught from a young age that in order to survive, he had to be tough. The stories of his cruelty, the gang violence, the need to assert dominance, all of it seemed to stem from a place of deep insecurity. Elijah was no stranger to hardship himself. He had seen pain, had fought to make a life for Marcus after his wife passed. But Elijah had found peace in understanding others, in recognizing that the pain people carried could either break them or fuel them to do better. He had lived by a motto: rise above it, Jake. On the other hand, seemed to let his pain define him. It was time for Elijah to try to change that. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Elijah decided it was time. He had learned where Jake would be, alone, near the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect opportunity to confront him. When Elijah arrived, he found Jake leaning against a battered motorcycle, staring out at the horizon. The man's hardened demeanor seemed even more pronounced in the fading light. But there was something else there, something beneath the surface that Elijah had seen in his research. "You've been avoiding me," Elijah called out from the edge of the parking lot. Jake turned, his gaze narrowing, but there was no immediate hostility in his eyes. "What do you want now?" he growled, pushing himself off the bike. Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with intent. "I want to understand you, Jake." Jake laughed, though there was a bitterness in the sound. "Understand me? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Elijah replied. "I know about your childhood, about how you were pushed around, made to feel worthless. I know that pain still drives you." Jake's face tightened, his eyes flickering with anger, but he didn't immediately lash out. "You don't know a damn thing," he spat. "You think you can understand what it's like to be me? To be nothing? To have nothing?" Elijah stood his ground, the words coming out with a surprising tenderness. "I do know, Jake. I do. I'm not saying I had it as bad as you, but I faced my own share of battles. You're not alone in this world, but I see you fighting the wrong battles. You're fighting the people who could help you, not hurt you." For a moment, Jake didn't respond. His jaw clenched as he looked at Elijah, his chest rising and falling with tension. Elijah took a deep breath, knowing this was a moment he had been waiting for. "You're still that scared little boy, aren't you?" Elijah said softly, but with unshakable conviction. "You're still trying to prove to the world that you're somebody. But what you don't realize is, you're just like the rest of us. You've been looking for control, for power, because you think it'll give you meaning. But it won't. Not until you let go of the past and start looking at who you really are." Jake's eyes narrowed dangerously, but there was something in his expression that flickered. Something vulnerable that Elijah had never expected to see. The gang leader turned his back for a moment, his fists clenched, and Elijah watched him closely, silently waiting for the storm to pass. Then, Jake spoke in a low voice that betrayed his turmoil. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wish it could be different? I've spent my whole life fighting, because that's all I know. If I stop, if I show any weakness, they'll come for me. I'll be nothing." Elijah's heart softened, but he remained firm. "You're not nothing, Jake. You're a person who's been hurt, yes. But you don't have to keep hurting others to prove your worth. You can choose to let go of that rage, that anger. It doesn't have to define you." Jake turned slowly, his face still set in a mask of resistance. But there was something else there now, something softer. His voice cracked as he spoke again. "I don't know how to stop. I've been this way for too long. It's all I have left." Elijah stepped forward, his voice gentle but strong. "Then start with one choice. Start with letting go of the need to hurt people. Let it go, Jake, and you can start living again." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's posture softened, and for the first time in years, Elijah saw a flicker of doubt cross the biker leader's face. The power Elijah had anticipated gaining from this confrontation didn't come from force or intimidation. It came from vulnerability. Elijah had held up a mirror, showing Jake what he had become, but more importantly, showing him the possibility of who he could be. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his back, still lost in his thoughts. But Elijah knew the seed had been planted. And even if it didn't change everything overnight, it was a turning point. Meanwhile, at home, Marcus had been practicing tirelessly on the makeshift guitar provided by Mr. Thompson. Each strum, each chord, was like a small victory over his fears, a sign that he was slowly rebuilding his confidence. Elijah returned home later that night, his heart heavy but hopeful. He found Marcus in the garage, strumming quietly. The sound of the guitar, though imperfect, filled the room with warmth. "You're getting better," Elijah said softly, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus smiled up at his father. "I think I'm ready to play again. Not just for me, but for us." Elijah nodded, knowing that no matter what happened with Jake, he and Marcus would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, but the choice to rise above their struggles had already been made. And that, Elijah knew, was where true strength began. The days following Elijah's conversation with Jake were tense and filled with uncertainty. Though Jake had appeared unsettled, it was clear that he had not fully processed the conversation. In fact, It seemed to push him deeper into the very anger and control he had been hiding for years. His temper flared more than ever, and he began to take it out on his own gang members, no longer willing to mask his frustration. Jake, who had once commanded fear with an air of intimidation, now turned on his own group, growing impatient with their every move. His once confident swagger became erratic. When one of his gang members, a burly man named Doug, questioned his tactics, Jake's response was violent. The tension within the gang was palpable, and it became increasingly clear that Jake was unraveling. The once tight-knit group of bikers was starting to show signs of internal strife. Jake was no longer the leader everyone feared. He was a man cracking under the weight of his own pride and insecurities. Elijah, watching the situation closely, knew this was his opportunity. He had learned that in moments of chaos, it was important to remain calm and strategic. He had already spoken to the townspeople, those who had supported him from the beginning, and now it was time to rally them further. He gathered them in the town hall, a small but welcoming building in the center of town that had seen its fair share of struggles. People of all ages filled the room, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. As Elijah stood before them, he felt a weight settle on his shoulders, but it wasn't fear. It was responsibility. He had to lead them now, not just for his son, but for the entire community. "Elijah's right," Sarah said from the front of the room, her voice steady but determined. "We've all seen what's been happening. It's time to show them that we stand together. But we do it peacefully, not through violence." Elijah nodded, standing tall. "We've been pushed to the brink," he said, his voice strong yet calm. "But we don't have to fight back with fists. The bikers want us to be afraid. They want to divide us, but they can't do that if we stand united. We will show them that kindness, dignity, and respect are stronger than intimidation." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Elijah saw the shift in the air. People were ready to act, but they needed to believe they could win without violence. "We will organize," Elijah continued. "We'll stand together in public spaces. We'll support each other in our businesses. And we'll make sure that Marcus and every young person in this town knows that they have a community that will always stand by them." The townsfolk were inspired. From that moment on, the community came together in small but meaningful ways. Neighbors offered to help each other with daily chores. Local businesses displayed signs of support, and people began to walk the streets in groups, showing the bikers that they would not be intimidated. But it wasn't just the town that was growing stronger. It was Marcus, too. The emotional toll of the guitar incident had weighed heavily on him. But with his father's guidance, Marcus found a way to express his pain. In the quiet of the garage, Marcus sat with his makeshift guitar, the one Mr. Thompson had built for him. He ran his fingers over the strings, still awkward and unrefined, but it was a start. He began to play a simple melody, his thoughts drifting to his late grandfather, who had once taught him how to play. His grandfather had always believed in him, had always seen the spark of something great within him. One evening, as Marcus sat strumming, his fingers began to form chords that felt right. Chords that spoke to the ache in his chest, the ache that came from losing something important and seeing it torn away. The lyrics came slowly at first, but then they poured out raw and vulnerable. Asterisk Grandpa, I hope you're listening. I've got so much left to say. The world's been tough, but I'm still trying to play my heart, to find my way. Asterisk, the song wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most polished or technically advanced piece of music he had ever written, but it was the most honest. It was his grief, his anger, and his hope all wrapped into one. Marcus felt lighter with every note, each chord helping him reclaim a part of himself that the bikers had stolen from him. He wasn't just a boy whose guitar had been destroyed. He was a musician, and no one could take that away from him. As he finished the last line, he looked up to find his father standing in the doorway, watching him with pride. That was beautiful, Marcus, Elijah said quietly. You've turned your pain into something powerful. Marcus smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I think it's the only way I know how to deal with it, Dad. Elijah stepped into the room and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've always had that gift, and I'm proud of you for finding your way back to it." Later that week, the town's resistance grew stronger as word of their united front spread. The peaceful protests, the supportive gestures, the outpouring of solidarity, it was all working. Even as Jake and his gang saw their power slipping away, they tried to escalate their intimidation, but it was too late. The more they pushed, the more the town pushed back. One afternoon, as Jake and his gang rolled into town, they were met not by fear, but by a sea of people standing tall and unwavering. Elijah stood at the front, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder as they faced down the bikers together. It was a moment that spoke volumes. The town was no longer afraid. Jake looked around, his jaw tightening as he realized the tide had turned. His gang wasn't as united as before, and the town had proven that it wasn't going to bow down to intimidation anymore. He could feel the cracks in his control widening, but this time, there would be no escape. In that moment, Elijah's strategy had worked. They had not only stood up to Jake and his gang, they had reclaimed their sense of power, strength, and unity. And it was all thanks to the unwavering support of a community that refused to be broken. It wasn't just a victory for Marcus and Elijah. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. The town had found its voice. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the town grew heavier. It was clear that the bikers, though visibly shaken by the united front of the townsfolk, had no intention of backing down. Jake, in particular, was determined to reclaim his power and assert control once more. He had lost too much in too short a time, and his pride wouldn't allow him to let the community's resistance go unchallenged. The bikers' final act of intimidation came 1 week before Marcus's highly anticipated performance at the town's annual festival. It was supposed to be a celebration of unity and the town's strength, a night for people to come together and showcase their talents. Marcus had been practicing his grandfather's song, and the performance was meant to be a symbolic gesture of both personal healing and public triumph. But Jake saw this event as the perfect opportunity to make a statement, to prove that he and his gang could still instill fear into the hearts of the townspeople. Jake and his gang devised a plan to disrupt Marcus's performance. They would show up, make a scene, and remind everyone who was in charge. Their intention was clear: to stop Marcus from playing, to make the night a night of terror instead of triumph. They would use their violence, their intimidation, to undermine everything the town had been building. Word quickly spread that Jake was planning something big. Elijah heard the rumors first, whispers in the cafe and the town hall, and from Sarah, who had overheard bikers talking about their intentions. The more Elijah thought about it, the more certain he became that this was the moment of truth. The bikers would either be defeated or solidify their dominance in the town. Elijah had prepared for this day ever since the first act of violence against Marcus. Now, it was time to protect his son, his community, and everything they had fought for. He called a meeting with the townsfolk in the same hall where they had gathered before. The room was thick with anticipation. People had grown stronger in their resolve, but they knew that the bikers wouldn't go down without a fight. This wasn't just about a concert or a performance. It was about standing up to the fear and oppression that had loomed over their town for so long. "Elijah's right," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We're not backing down. This town has survived worse, and we've come together in ways Jake never expected. But we can't let our guard down now." Elijah stood at the front, his face hard with determination. "This is more than just a performance. This is about showing Jake and his gang that we will not let them control us anymore. The fear they've instilled in us, it stops here. Tonight, we stand firm, and we protect what's ours, our community, our people, and our freedom to live without fear." The townspeople nodded in agreement. There was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before, a unified strength that made Elijah believe they had a chance. They would not let the bikers ruin Marcus's performance. They would not allow their sense of community to be shattered by intimidation. But as the night of the event drew closer, the tension continued to build. Every interaction was laced with unease. People glanced over their shoulders, looking for signs of the bikers' approach. There was an unspoken understanding among the townsfolk. They were ready for the fight that would define their future. The night of the festival arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. The event was to take place in the town square, with tables, music, and food lining the streets. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, but beneath the surface, everyone knew what was coming. The townspeople had made preparations. Elijah had organized groups of people to stand guard at key points, ensuring the bikers couldn't disrupt the event without facing resistance. Marcus, dressed in his best shirt, stood nervously backstage, holding his guitar. His hand shook slightly, but his heart was steady. He had come so far. His song, the one he had written for his grandfather, felt more important now than ever. It wasn't just about playing a tune. It was about showing the world and Jake that he would not be broken. Elijah stood by his side, watching as Marcus adjusted his guitar strap. "You're going to do great," Elijah said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "This is your moment, Marcus. Don't let anyone take that from you." Marcus looked up at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm ready, Dad." But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town square, a group of bikers appeared at the edge of the crowd. They were easy to spot, their leather jackets and tattoos unmistakable. Jake and his gang had arrived, and their presence was immediately felt. The tension in the air shifted, and the townsfolk braced themselves for what was to come. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he scanned the crowd, noticing the bikers forming a loose circle at the back of the square. They were waiting for something, waiting to make their move. Elijah turned to the townspeople who had gathered for the event, nodding at each of them with silent assurance. They would stand firm, no matter what happened. The moment Marcus was called to the stage, the entire square fell into a hushed silence. As he stepped up to the microphone, the sound of his guitar rang out, clear and pure. He started to play the first few chords of his song, the one he had written for his grandfather, his fingers trembling but steady. But before the song could progress, a low, guttural voice cut through the air. "You think you can just stand up here and play, kid?" It was Jake. He had pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face twisted in a snarl. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Jake's eyes locked on Marcus, his gaze filled with contempt. But then, before he could make his move, Elijah stepped forward, his voice rising above the crowd. "Not tonight, Jake," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "This town will not bow to you anymore." The bikers, for the first time, seemed unsure. The crowd of townsfolk, united and resolute, stood behind Elijah, their collective strength palpable. Jake paused, his eyes flickering with hesitation. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the entire town holding its breath, waiting for the outcome. And in that moment, with the strumming of Marcus's guitar filling the square, the showdown began, not through violence, but through sheer willpower. The community had chosen to stand together, and Jake had nowhere to go but retreat. The tension in the town square was palpable, but as Marcus strummed the first chords of his song, something remarkable happened. His hands, steady despite the weight of the moment, coaxed a melody from the guitar, a song filled with love, loss, and the spirit of perseverance. The music filled the air, its emotional power resonating with the crowd. It was more than just a performance. It was a testament to everything Marcus had endured, everything his family had fought for. His song, dedicated to his late grandfather, transcended the space between him and the audience. People of all ages stood in silent reverence, their hearts moved by the sincerity in his voice and the emotion in his playing. The melody wound its way through the crowd, and even those who had been skeptical or afraid of the bikers began to soften. The unity of the community, their shared belief in the power of music and the strength of kindness, was undeniable. In the back of the crowd, Jake stood, his arms crossed and his face twisted in a scowl. He had come here to destroy, to assert his dominance one last time. But the sounds of Marcus's guitar cut through his anger like a blade. He had never heard anything so raw, so heartfelt. For the first time in years, something stirred inside him, something that made him question the path he had chosen. The bikers around him, too, seemed affected by the performance. Some shifted uncomfortably, their tough exteriors cracked by the sincerity of the moment. There was no denying the emotional intensity of the music, and even the hardest hearts couldn't remain unmoved. As Marcus played, Jake's posture began to shift. He stood a little straighter, and for a moment his anger faltered. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, at the townspeople who had once feared him, who now stood united in support of Marcus and of each other. The power of their unity, the strength of their resolve, weighed heavily on him. He turned to his gang, his face hardening with an intensity that was less about anger and more about inner conflict. The same conflict that had been brewing in him for weeks. Ever since Elijah had confronted him, ever since he had seen the cracks in his own hardened exterior, it was all too much to ignore now. Jake took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on Elijah, who stood unwavering in the crowd, his gaze focused on Marcus. The two men locked eyes for a moment, the weight of everything they had gone through settling between them. Then, Jake did something no one expected. He turned to his gang and, without a word, gestured for them to follow him. The bikers hesitated, confused, but Jake's quiet command was enough. Slowly, they began to move, retreating toward the edge of the crowd. The tension in the square began to dissolve as they disappeared into the shadows. The power they had once wielded over the town was gone, swept away by the strength of a boy's song and the unyielding resolve of the people who had refused to cower in fear any longer. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the bikers faded from view, the weight of the moment sinking in. It wasn't just a victory for Marcus. It was a victory for the entire town, a triumph of community, kindness, and resilience. As Marcus finished his song, his heart pounding in his chest, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't just a celebration of his music. It was a celebration of everything he had overcome, everything the town had endured together. Elijah stepped forward, his face filled with pride as he embraced his son, holding him tightly as the cheers of the crowd surrounded them. "That was incredible, son," Elijah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Marcus smiled, his eyes shining with tears. "We did it, Dad. We all did." As the applause slowly died down, Jake's gang was gone, and the town was left with a renewed sense of hope. Some members of the gang, shaken by the night's events, returned to apologize for their actions. They approached Elijah and Marcus, some with heads hung low, others with genuine remorse in their eyes. They had seen the power of kindness and unity in a way they hadn't expected, and they began to question their own choices. One by one, they asked for forgiveness, and many of them sought redemption. Some promised to leave town and start over, while others stayed behind, determined to change their lives and make amends for the hurt they had caused. The gang, once a symbol of terror and fear, began to dissolve, its members slowly finding their way back to their own humanity. For Elijah, Marcus, and the town, this was more than just a victory over the bikers. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The fear that had once ruled their lives was gone, replaced by a sense of unity, compassion, and strength. The town had stood together, and they had triumphed, not through violence or retaliation, but through courage, kindness, and the power of community. As the festival continued into the night, with music and laughter filling the air, Elijah and Marcus stood together, watching the horizon. The broken guitar, once a symbol of pain, had been mended, not just by Mr. Thompson, but by the love and strength of the people who had supported them. The community had been healed, and in the end, it was the bonds they had formed that had proven to be stronger than any act of cruelty. And as the stars twinkled above, Marcus picked up his guitar once more, strumming the strings, knowing that this was just the beginning of a life filled with hope, music, and the unshakable belief that even the darkest moments could be overcome with the power of love. As the last echoes of applause faded, the crowd began to settle, their hearts still warmed by the emotional weight of Marcus's performance and the dramatic turn of events. Elijah stepped forward, his face a portrait of pride and quiet strength. The crowd, still buzzing with the aftermath of the confrontation, fell silent as they turned their attention to him. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had experienced together. "Tonight, we witnessed something extraordinary," he began, his eyes sweeping over the gathered townsfolk. "Not just a boy's song, but the power of community, of unity, of standing up for what's right. We've faced challenges, and there have been times when it seemed easier to bow our heads and let fear control us. But what we've learned is that fear has no power over us unless we let it." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was rapt, hanging on every sentence, as if the entire town had been waiting for someone to say what they had all felt in their hearts. "We stood together because we understood that the only way to overcome injustice is through courage. Not violence, not hatred, but courage. Courage to face our fears, courage to protect each other, and courage to believe in something greater than ourselves. We didn't fight the bikers with fists. We fought them with the strength of our resolve, the power of kindness, and the belief that we could make a difference." Elijah's gaze turned to Marcus, who stood beside him, his guitar still in hand, the song of redemption lingering in the air. "And Marcus," Elijah continued, his voice filled with warmth, "you taught us all something invaluable tonight. You've shown us that resilience is not about avoiding pain. It's about transforming that pain into something beautiful, something powerful. You turned your sorrow into strength, and through your music, you've inspired us all to do the same." Marcus's eyes shone with gratitude as he looked at his father, the weight of his journey and his music, finally feeling like it had led him to a place of healing. He had come to understand that his creativity, his art, was not just an expression of his grief, but a bridge to others, a way to turn his pain into a source of collective strength. The emotional journey he had gone through was not just his own, it was shared by the entire town. Elijah's voice softened as he addressed the crowd one last time. "This is a new chapter for us, one where we don't let fear, hatred, or prejudice define who we are. We are not defined by the actions of a few. We are defined by our collective spirit, our kindness, and our ability to forgive, to grow, and to stand together." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting the lessons they had learned. There was a palpable shift in the air, a sense of empowerment and hope that had been lacking before. They had faced down their fears, and in doing so, they had proven that there was more power in love, kindness, and unity than in intimidation or violence. As Elijah concluded his speech, a hush fell over the square. This town, this community, has shown us all that we can rise above the darkness, that we can take our brokenness and rebuild something beautiful. We are stronger for it, and we are better for it. And together, we will continue to rise with kindness in our hearts and courage in our souls. The crowd erupted in applause once more, not just for the performance, but for the profound sense of change that had taken place. The message was clear. True strength was found in community, in the courage to stand up for what was right, and in the willingness to transform pain into power. Marcus felt a deep sense of peace wash over him as the applause continued. He had not only reclaimed his music, but had helped his entire town reclaim their sense of hope. He had learned that resilience didn't just mean enduring. It meant creating something new, something powerful, even out of the deepest hurt. And in doing so, he had inspired others to find their own strength and creativity in the face of adversity. The story of redemption, unity, and overcoming prejudice was now part of their collective history. It wasn't just about one boy, one broken guitar, or one confrontation with a gang. It was about a community learning to face its darkest moments with light, kindness, and courage. The moral was clear. Through the power of community and the strength of standing up for what is right, one could overcome even the most daunting challenges. It was not violence or intimidation that brought change, but unity, creativity, and the belief that kindness could triumph over cruelty. The power of redemption lay not only in the individual, but in the collective heart of a united people, rising above their differences and fears to become something greater than they ever imagined. The morning after the event, the town felt different lighter, somehow. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a feeling that everyone shared. The brokenness that had once defined them had been transformed into something much stronger. And standing at the heart of this transformation was Marcus's repaired guitar, now more than just a musical instrument. It had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when something precious is torn apart, it can be rebuilt stronger and more beautiful than before. Marcus took the guitar in his hands, its wood gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of not just his talent, but his journey. As he strummed the first few notes, the familiar melody flowed effortlessly, his fingers dancing over the strings with a newfound sense of purpose. His music, once born from pain and loss, now resonated with hope, touching the hearts of everyone who heard it. People who had never taken the time to truly listen before were drawn to his melodies. And Marcus found himself playing for more than just the people in his town. His music began to spread, beyond the park, beyond the town, and soon it became a beacon of hope for anyone who needed to hear it. Even as Marcus's music touched the lives of so many, the final chapter of this story was unfolding. Jake, the once feared leader of the biker gang, had quietly packed up his things and prepared to leave town. He had become a different man, changed by the events he had witnessed and the confrontation that had challenged everything he had believed. He had, in a sense, been humbled. And as he passed by Elijah's mechanic shop one final time, he paused. Elijah, who had been working quietly, noticed Jake standing at the edge of the lot. Without a word, he wiped his hands and walked over. The two men stood in silence for a moment, each aware of the gravity of what had transpired. "I've been thinking," Jake began, his voice low but sincere. "I came here to break things, to make people fear me. But what I've learned, what I've seen here, it's different. I never thought there was another way to live, but you've shown me that there is." He paused, looking Elijah in the eyes. "You didn't fight me with fists or anger. You fought with your heart, and you brought this whole town together. For the first time in my life, I see that there's something more powerful than fear, something worth fighting for. I needed to thank you for showing me that." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. There was no need for grand gestures or apologies. Jake's acknowledgement was enough. "You're welcome," Elijah said simply, offering a handshake. "We all have a choice, Jake. It's never too late to change." With that, Jake turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his own transformation. As he left town, he carried with him a piece of the lesson he had learned. The lesson that true strength came from kindness, from unity, and from the courage to change. Back in the park, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. Marcus sat under the tree where he had once played in fear, where his guitar had been shattered. Now, with his repaired guitar in hand, he returned to the place where his journey had begun. Elijah sat beside him, watching quietly as his son began to play once more. The melody filled the air, sweet and strong, as Marcus poured his heart into the song. It was no longer just a tribute to his grandfather. It was a tribute to everything he had overcome, to the strength of his family, and to the community that had come together to support him. Elijah sat in quiet reflection, his heart full of pride and gratitude. They had been through so much together, and yet here they were, stronger than ever. His son had grown in ways he hadn't even imagined, and the bond they shared had only deepened. There was no need for words. There was only the music, the soft hum of the strings, and the peaceful silence between them. As the last note echoed through the park, the camera slowly zoomed out, capturing the quiet moment between father and son. The story had come full circle. What had once been broken had been repaired, not just physically but emotionally, and the healing was complete. The video ended with Marcus and Elijah sitting together, side by side, under the same tree where they had first begun this journey. The music, the community, and the lessons learned from their trials all came together in that one peaceful moment. There was no more need for confrontation or struggle, only the quiet knowledge that, together, they had created something lasting, something beautiful. The screen faded to black, and the final message was clear. Even in the face of adversity, the power of love, resilience, and kindness could transform the darkest moments into something that would endure, inspiring others for years to come.